And we now come to the next item of business, which is questions to the First Minister. Question number 1 from Ian Gray.
To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Later today I will have meetings to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, as of Tuesday, 6,000 convicted criminals a year will escape jail because the First Minister pushed through legislation against short prison sentences. Kenny McCaskill has said that it's fine because these convicted criminals are just daft laddies. Does the First Minister agree?
Minister.
Well, first of all, let's have a look at this phrase, pushed through. This is a minority government which, as Ian Gray knows, has to appeal for support to gain a majority, particularly in legislative terms. The reason that the criminal justice system has been changed in Scotland is because a majority of this Parliament believed that was the right direction to take. Now, at various times, Ian Gray keeps saying to us, we must follow the will of the Parliament. But actually what he means is, we must follow the will of the Parliament when it's convenient to Ian Gray. Now, there are other aspects of the justice system which, of course, have been carried through by this administration. The 1,000 extra police officers on the streets and communities of Scotland carried through with support from the Conservative Party. But the significant thing about the penal changes which have resulted in the lowest level of crime for 30 years in Scotland, whether it be the move to comprehensive and strong community sentences or the 1,000 extra officers in the streets of Scotland, that none of them have been supported by the Labour Party.
Ian Gray.
It's all very well having 1,000 additional police officers, but when they arrest criminals, it matters what happens to those criminals. Of those 6,000 daft laddies last year, 736 of them were violent offenders, 148 were knife criminals, and 17 were sex offenders. This year, they won't go to jail at all. They will do community service. We read this morning that they might get 30 days of hard knitting. So can the First Minister tell me how many criminals, given these arduous sentences, ever even complete them?
First Minister.
Well, actually, it's not, as Ian Gray puts it, all very well that there are 1,000 extra police officers in the streets of Scotland. It's actually all very important that these officers are protecting people across the country, and not a single one of these officers would have been employed if we had listened to the Labour Party. Nor is it the case that having a 30-year low in recorded crime is a mere incidental. For the first time in recorded crime statistics, that fear of crime is dropping across Scottish communities. Now, my belief is that that is because of the additional officers delivered by this administration, not one of which was supported by the Labour Party. Now, when it comes to the presumption against sentences of 3 months or less, the presumption against sentences, this is not just a policy that gained the support of parties across this Parliament. This is a policy, when we look down south to England, if my memory serves me right, that the new leader of the Labour Party said at his party conference, or around his party conference, when Ken Clarke, he says, brings forward proposals to avoid short sentences, then we in the Labour Party shouldn't have knee-jerk opposition. Now, if Ed Miliband is not having knee-jerk opposition in the Westminster Parliament to penal reform, why is it all Ian Gray's got to offer week after week is knee-jerk opposition in this Parliament?
Ian Gray.
What's important, Presiding Officer, is that the justice system backs those police officers and backs the public. And even those who agree with the First Minister with regard to short sentences, which I don't, would tell him that this policy would only work if the community justice system is working too. But the fact is that 40% of those sentenced to community service don't finish their sentences. And in some parts of Scotland, that is as high as 2/3. The community sentence system is not working but the First Minister is cramming thousands more offenders into it. Everyone knows that many will get off scot-free. That's why the First Minister is seen by so many as soft-touch salmon. Does he know, under his government, how many times you have to be convicted before you actually go to jail?
First Minister.
Can I point out to Ian Gray that he can't just sweep away the fact that he believes that these 1,000 extra officers are not being backed up in the judicial system for two reasons. One is, if it had been up to the Labour Party, they wouldn't have existed at all. They wouldn't have been there to be backed up by the judicial system. And secondly, as we saw in the Public Prisons Committee debate on knife crime and in other evidence to this committee, it is police officers like John Carnahan of 34 years standing. I've been a cop for 34 years, and it's police officers such as that who support the direction of travel of this Parliament and this Government with regard to the judicial system. We should judge these matters, and we have the ability now, by results. The approach of this Government to crime and punishment in Scotland has delivered a 30-year low in recorded crime, has delivered 1,000 extra officers across the streets and communities of Scotland. And it's an approach that recognises the futility of short sentences, where the vast majority of people re-offend, and the hope that's required from community justice, where the majority of people do not re-offend. The Labour Party's position in this is ridiculous, impossible, and doesn't serve the people of Scotland.
Ian Gray.
As ever, the First Minister has no answer to any of the questions. These Freedom of Information figures show that some first-time prisoners sent to jail for the first time had 40 previous convictions. They had not re-offended. They had re-offended 40 times before they went to jail. Hundreds of them had 10, 20 and 30 previous convictions before they ever faced jail. They don't go to jail, and some of them don't even turn up for community service. And all of this is before the Scottish Government abolished thousands of short sentences. It isn't right. Does the First Minister understand that it is the law-abiding public who are being treated like daft laddies by him?
First Minister.
What I believe is, and I quote, the Commission recommends that if the Custodial Sensitive Weapons Act is to be implemented, its implementation must follow of the Commission's other recommendations and the achievement of a reduction in the short sentence prison population. That, of course, is the report of Henry McLeish, the former Labour First Minister of Scotland. And let's take the difference between Henry McLeish as a former First Minister who experienced these things in office, who saw the futility of short sentences and made a recommendation backed across this Parliament by majority, and that of the knee-jerk opposition of Ian Gray, with nothing constructive to offer, who is left flailing about at the facts of position of 1,000 extra officers in the streets of Scotland, delivering a 30-year low in recorded crime, with progressive reform for the criminal justice of Scotland. It's making this country a safer place under this government.
Question 2, Annabel Goldie.
To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
Well, I'm hoping to meet the Prime Minister in the next couple of weeks.
Annabel Goldie.
Can I ask the First Minister, is 30 days knitting a tough community sentence?
First Minister.
I think Annabel Goldie should have the flexibility to adjust her question after hearing Ian Gray's efforts, although perhaps after hearing Ian Gray's efforts, she perhaps thought she could do rather better than the Labour leader. What I believe is the reality of a 30-year low in recorded crime in Scotland, and I believe that the reforms passed by this Parliament by majority are going to further improve the criminal justice situation in Scotland.
Annabel Goldie.
Presiding Officer, can I just point out a headline in a paper this morning, sentenced to 30 days hard knitting, and can I just inform the First Minister that 2 knitting needles, a ball of wool and a cup of tea are not a tough community sentence. In Scotland we call that a knitting bee. Now, I have to give credit to the First Minister for at least acknowledging that because of the Scottish Conservatives we have delivered 1,000 extra police in Scotland. But the point is the SNP is putting all of that at risk with their soft-touch Scotland approach. More tagging, less jail, failing to end automatic early release, scrapping short prison sentences. Isn't the reality that for all the First Minister's tough talk about tough community sentences, it's all candy floss and flim-flam? And under this SNP government, there's no such thing as tough community sentences.
First Minister.
And I suppose the real difficulty for Annabel Goldie and indeed for her backbenches is the recognition that Ken Clarke, as a Tory Secretary and Lord Chancellor in an administration, a coalition administration south of the border, is now pursuing exactly the same policies.
We don't take points of order during questions.
I think I understand why Annabel Goldie didn't want to hear this point, but nonetheless, I really do think. I think it's a difficulty that a Tory Chancellor in a coalition administration is pursuing exactly the same policies against short sentences in favour of community justice that this administration is pursuing in Scotland. Now, why would that be the case if he hadn't analysed the position and come to that conclusion? Is he being overwritten by the Liberal Democrats in the coalition, or is he just a sensible Lord Chancellor who is trying to improve the justice situation in England, just as this administration has pursued it in Scotland?
Ms Goldie.
Presiding Officer, as the First Minister knows, I'm responsible for my party's justice policy in Scotland. And the First Minister is responsible for the justice system in Scotland, and isn't it time he started doing the job?
First Minister.
Well, I think it's a case of short memories, not just short sentences. At last week's question time, Annabel Goldie asked me about a policy being pursued by the coalition government south of the border with regard to cancer drugs. Now this week she's complaining when I refer to another coalition policy south of the border which has the common sense approach that short prison sentences don't work. They don't protect the public. They don't serve society. And that is why the justice policies of this government and by majority this Parliament are the way forward for Scotland.
Question 3, Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he plans to meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
I met the Secretary of State for Scotland yesterday at the economic summit between the two free devolved administrations and the United Kingdom Government.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you. Yesterday the Scottish Government said they would transfer social workers to the NHS under government direction. The Government also planned to scrap local fire and police boards and put them under government direction. Council tax levels are directed nationally, school buildings have been given to a quango under ministerial control, and even local salt stocks are now, for our roads, are now decided nationally. Would the First Minister tell us whether there are any other areas of responsibility he plans to remove from local government?
First Minister.
I cannot believe that Tavish Scott is actually disputing the effectiveness of having the resilient supply of salt stocks nationally held during the recent weather emergency in Scotland. Nor, I hope, would he dispute the obvious advantage of having a resilient supply of vaccine for the flu virus held centrally. Tavish Scott must understand that we judge these matters in terms of effective government and what delivers for the people of Scotland. And in both these examples, having that central resilience supply was obviously in the best interests of Scotland. So instead of taking a predisposed position to these matters, will Tavish Scott try and address these things as what delivers the public services to which the people of Scotland are entitled?
Tavish Scott.
I thought I was asking the question, not being asked it. He'll surely concede, even after that question, that there is an element of chaos in the government's plans for elderly people. Because Lord Sutherland, who reviewed free personal care a couple of years ago, said yesterday the time for talking is over. But on the same press release, the Health Minister said yesterday she's setting up a new group as a first step to beginning discussions. Elderly people, as we know, are still waiting for the care they need. But today, 38,000 social work staff looking after their elderly across Scotland can't concentrate on that because yesterday they had their futures thrown into doubt by a footnote on a government press release. When are those hard-working local staff going to get the answers about their futures?
Well, I think Tavish Scott made an error, if I may say so, in not giving Lord Sutherland the benefit of quoting his full quotation. So let me do it to the Chamber. I quote, "Lead commissioning provides the best and quickest way of achieving an integrated care system, and I believe the Scottish Government's approach is the right one. It avoids the need for new legislation, wholesale reorganisation, which means improvements can begin to be made straight away. The time for talking is over. It is now time to just get on with it." That's what Lord Sutherland said, backing this government's approach.
I'll take a supplementary from Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've written to the First Minister, so he will be aware of the thousands of my constituents who are protesting at the proposed siting of a pyrolysis incinerator in Coatbridge, which was refused planning permission by the Council. Given that, under the 1997 Planning Act, it is in Alex Salmond's government's power to refuse the current appeal by the developer, will he do so and put the interests of the people of Coatbridge before the private profits of Shore Energy?
Well, if Elaine Smith has been looking up the Act, she must know I cannot give a judgment or determination on a matter of ministerial discretion in this way. I think if Mike Rumbles wants to raise other matters, then why doesn't he catch the presiding officer's eye and then give a question to which he'll get a robust answer?
Take another one from Jackie Bailey.
The First Minister will be aware that the mortality rate for deaths from C. difficile at the Vale of Leven Hospital has been revised upwards. Rather than the 55 people affected and 18 deaths originally reported, the public inquiry is now considering 60 people affected with 38 deaths, a staggering number confirming this is the worst outbreak in the UK. Would the First Minister agree that further steps need to be taken to ensure that C. diff is recorded appropriately on death certificates? And secondly, can he advise whether he or the Cabinet Secretary for Health have been told of a further delay to the conclusion of the public inquiry?
Well, this is an independent public inquiry which is live and ongoing, which of course was established by the Cabinet Secretary. It must be given its full latitude to examine all of the issues in this tragic and serious case. While we accept that the public inquiry has that job and remit, I am sure Jackie Bailey would be the very first to acknowledge that C. difficile cases have been halved in Scotland, which is welcome improvement in what is a tragic and difficult condition.
A question for Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what discussions have taken place with representatives of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, given the likelihood of job losses in the third sector due to budgetary constraints. Mr.
Minister.
Well, Christine Graham will be aware of the importance that the Scottish Government places on our relationship with SCVO. We are in regular contact with them. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth met with SCVO and a range of third sector organisations to discuss the independent budget review, and on 26 January officials attended the SCVO Policy Committee. The Westminster cuts have had an impact across the third sector. We are committed to working with the sector to protect services wherever we can. I am pleased that the SCVO is well represented on the Christie Commission, given the vital role that the third sector have to play in providing these services, especially for the disadvantaged.
Christine Graham.
I thank the First Minister for his answer. The First Minister will be aware that in England, citizens' advice bureaus are being closed down just when, as in Scotland, there is an increasing demand for advice on debt, changes to the benefit system and eligibility, and homelessness. As CABs in Scotland are substantially funded by local authorities, will he enter into discussions with COSLA on this matter, as money spent keeping CAB doors open is, in my opinion, spending to save by preventing, for example, ill health, family breakups and loss of home?
First Minister.
Well, that's a hugely important point. I mean, Citizens Advice Bureau provide a valuable service to communities and indeed to individuals across Scotland. I hope the members across the chamber will join me in putting on record their appreciation for the work that they do. The Scottish Government is working with local authorities on protecting services from the impact of the spending cuts, as well as other measures such as the increase in VAT. An increase, of course, will cost Scotland over £1 billion over the next year. So that's why the spending settlement clause of local government for 2011-12 sees a reduction in revenue of only 2.6%. That is a hugely difficult settlement, but dramatically better than what's been experienced elsewhere in these islands. It's better in local governments south of the border, better than all other portfolios covered by the Scottish budget, with the exception, of course, of the health portfolio, which, in my belief, needs and requires special protection.
Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Of course, the First Minister disregards the fact that there was pressure on the sector before the coalition cuts came in. These are now compounding them. And he also disregards the fact that local government potentially may disproportionately find its savings through a consequence for the voluntary sector. I wonder if the First Minister is aware of the concerns of those representing workers in the voluntary sector, not just about the huge pressure on those facing losing their jobs, but also on those who remain in post and are having to pick up the extra responsibilities to deliver the service they care about. Will the First Minister agree to meet with representatives of the voluntary sector workers and their unions to look urgently at what he can do to support them in these difficult times?
First Minister.
Well, I've set out what regular discussions we have, very recent regular discussions, but I'm very happy to meet the SCVO and the associate unions at any time, and I'll be delighted to do so. Can I just say to Joanne Lamont about the first part of her question? This issue she slipped in of coalition cuts, then that's absolutely true. It's a coalition government which has introduced a budget for next year which involves £1,300 million of cuts in Scottish public spending. But of course the reality is that in the year before last there was £500 million of cuts, and of course, as we know from the acknowledgement of the Labour Party leader Ed Miliband, that Labour were planning two-thirds of the cuts that Joanne Lamont now denounces. And I just think if she takes her questions and realises that the full extent, firstly, of the economic disaster into which the Labour Party led this country, and secondly, the consequences to public spending, which are bearing down on the voluntary sector and every other public sector, voluntary or otherwise, organisation in Scotland.
Hugh O'Donnell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In light of the First Minister's fulsome support for the voluntary sector and given his recent meeting with SCVO, I wonder if he would have a comment in relation to information that has been put to members of this chamber in relation to, and I quote from the document, the vital work by SCVO is being undermined by Scottish Government policies designed to protect the public sector. I wonder if he would clarify how we will reconcile the commitment to no compulsory redundancies in the public sector with the pressures that his government's decisions are placing on the voluntary sector.
First Minister.
Well, if I mentioned to Joanne Lamont that she should recognise the Labour Party's part in the public sector squeeze in Scotland, then I think it's time that Hugh O'Donnell recognised that he has colleagues in London who are leading the attack on public services. I think the no compulsory redundancies aim and ambition of this government is hugely important. It is vital, I think, for public services in Scotland, just as I recognise the key role of SCVO and the attendant voluntary sector organisations, which is exactly why they have been asked and have agreed to participate at the very heart of the Christie Commission. That is the priority which we put on the role and performance of the voluntary sector in Scotland.
Question 5, Desmond Nulty.
To ask the First Minister, in light of reported comments from the Educational Institute for Scotland, whether the Scottish Government will delay the introduction of new national exams.
First Minister.
No. The Curriculum for Excellence Management Board, which includes, of course, the teaching unions, the Directors of Education and indeed the Scottish Qualifications Authority, is clear in its advice that new qualifications are on track. Indeed, at its meeting on the 16th December, the Management Board explicitly recommended there should be no delay, that the new qualifications will be delivered on time in 2013-14. It should be remembered, despite the naysaying of doommongers that the new curriculum was successfully implemented in every single secondary school in Scotland from August. That is a track record of achievement that gives confidence to teachers, parents and pupils alike.
Des McNulty.
Presiding Officer, there are more than 3,000 fewer teachers now in Scotland's schools than in 2007, and officials are worried that next year we could lose 900 more, bringing the total number of teachers' jobs lost under the SNP to 4,000. On the Curriculum for Excellence, the issue is not whether the exams can be delivered by the Qualifications Agency, although they should have been delivered last June. They were promised in October, so where are they? But the issue really is whether teachers have confidence in the exams, or whether they believe pupils could be disadvantaged because of this government's mishandling of the implementation of the Curriculum for Excellence. Given what the EIS has said, will the First Minister order his Education Minister to hold an urgent meeting with both EIS and the SSTA, who Mr Russell chucked off the CFE Implementation Board, to get these reforms back on track and do what's needed?
First Minister.
Yes, indeed, but I've already pointed out the view of the Curriculum for Management Board on implementation, and I know that Des McNulty wouldn't be wanting to be counted himself among the doommongers whose forecasts in this matter have proven to be distinctly wide of the remark. And as for his first part of his supplementary, I really know that Des McNulty would want to have it on record that class size is at a record low, that we are delivering a COSLA deal, which includes a teaching place for every new teacher in Scotland in 2011. He will acknowledge that despite these hugely difficult circumstances, we have by far the lowest teacher unemployment in these islands. And if we can persuade Labour councils, who have the most deplorable record in employing post-probationers, to share the enthusiasm of the many councils who take a different approach, then we'll all be better off for the Labour Party implementing at local level what Des McNulty complains about at national level.
Question 6, Billy.
To ask the First Minister on what basis the Scottish Government decided to establish a one-stop shop at Glasgow Sheriff Court, increasing liaison between community service and social work staff.
Minister.
Well, can I say how delighted I was to see that Bill Aiken welcomed this new initiative in the letters page of the Herald newspaper on Tuesday of this week. I know from that letter that Bill Aiken will agree the Scottish Government has delivered measures to make community censuses tougher, faster and more effective. The pilot announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice last Sunday will receive funding of £175,000 from the Scottish Government. It will help ensure that offenders sentenced to unpaid work at Glasgow Sheriff Court begin their sentence immediately. When the Cabinet Secretary announced the new community payback order on the 1st of February, he also announced that £4 million will be available from the proceeds of crime funds to help support unpaid work projects across Scotland, to help make sure that benefits are delivered to communities as well as punishment to offenders.
The prospect of the Scottish Government making community service tougher is, to say the remote. But will the First Minister accept that we genuinely regard these measures as common sense, and they will introduce a degree of immediacy to community service, which will hopefully reduce the appalling breach rate referred to earlier by Mr Gray? But at the same time, will he recognise our disappointment that despite the resolution by the majority of this Parliament on 9 May 2009, no moves have been made to set up a community court pilot within the Sheriff Court complex in Glasgow along the lines of the highly successful New York City model?
First Minister.
I was about to welcome Bill Aiken to the enlightened majority in this Parliament. And I know it's difficult because there has to strike a balance that Bill Aiken has to strike between losing that reputation on crime built up over the years on one hand, on the other hand acknowledging, as he did in the Herald Letters column, that new initiatives are actually working, making community sentences faster. And I'm sure that Bill Aiken will accept that. I do think he should continue in this route of travel, because I think the majority of this Parliament would welcome Bill Aiken into the ranks of the enlightened majority who believe that we have a policy which will make criminal justice more effective, not just for the offender, but far more importantly for the communities who we are entitled to see paid back for the distress that has been caused by these offenders.
Robert Brown.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I wonder if I can ask the First Minister if he agrees that there are major gains for public safety from the more speedy and effective community orders assisted by this project in Glasgow. Does he agree with me also that if there are problems in the community service pay orders, which typically cost £1,000 to £4,000, the proper way forward is to sort the problems rather than to bang people up unnecessarily in another disposal in prison costing £40,000 a year with a reoffending rate twice as much?
First Minister.
Well, I agree. Because, of course, Robert Brown was as part of, I believe, the majority of this chamber who saw the logic and sense of the proposals which are now being unveiled. I welcome his support for that. I am certain it is the right direction of travel for criminal justice in Scotland. And those of us who believe in that can do it on the basis of a solid platform of seeing the lowest rate of recorded crime for 30 years in Scotland, to have the highest public satisfaction and the lowest fear of crime that we have ever had in Scotland, and to have these 1,000 extra officers patrolling the streets of Scotland and making our communities safe.
Margaret MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, you ruled earlier that the leader of the Conservative Party should keep her question until after questions had been taken, because we in this House didn't accept them during questions. Is that a convention or a standing order?
It's a convention, Ms MacDonald. That concludes questions to the First Minister. I suspend this sitting till 2:15.